Okay, so it is a few minutes past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Larissa. I'm the program manager here at the Jewish Women's Archive, and I'm so excited today to be joined by our special guest teacher, Alicia Jo Rabins, who I'm going to introduce in a minute. But first, I just want to go over technological pieces, as you can see on this slide. Using the icons, you can go ahead and adjust your volume to make sure that you can hear us clearly. Also, if you would like, you can go ahead and enable your webcam. It'll turn green when you click on the button. This is not required, but if you would like us to be able to see you, you are more than welcome to do that. We also have our hand raising icon, which I don't anticipate coming into play today, but just so you know, it's there if you do want to raise your hand. I do just want to note that today we're going to have everyone participate by typing into the chat box, and then we'll read your responses out loud. So that's why you don't see the microphone icon on this page today. So just a little bit of an introduction to the Jewish Women's Archive for anybody who is new to us. So JWA is a national nonprofit dedicated to making known the stories, struggles, and achievements of Jewish women in North America and beyond. And on our site, you'll find the world's largest repository of materials about and voices of Jewish women. As you can see here, our mission is to document Jewish women's stories, elevate their voices, and inspire them to be agents of change. So it's not just about collecting things and collecting stories, but about promoting them and demonstrating their value and making them accessible to the public. And we do that through some more traditional resources like our profiles and encyclopedia and curricula for educators, but also through things like our podcast, our blog, and our book club. I just want to give a quick shout out to any educators who are with us today. I know we have a mixed audience, but I just want to say to the educators in the room that you are our essential partners in sharing Jewish women's stories. So thank you for your work, and thank you to everyone for being here today. So I will continue to use this picture because I love
Playground
it so much.
selfie.
Right, it's the best. So again, you are attending Lilith, Demoness, or Heroine today with guest teacher Alicia Jo Rabins. And I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Alicia and let her introduce herself and her curriculum and our particular subject for today. So Alicia, the floor is yours, and I'm going to turn us over to your slideshow now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Larissa, and thanks for being here, everyone, and welcome as people are kind of trickling in. So I have a few things I want to say before we dive in. One of them is that I want to thank JWA for partnering with me, and also the Covenant Foundation, who have supported the creation of this curriculum, which is a series of study guides around my songs about women in Torah. So Girls in Trouble is this songwriting project that I have where each song is about a different woman character from the Torah. And then the Girls in Trouble curriculum sort of unpacks each song, at least 10 of them so far, and enables teachers to bring that into the classroom for teens and adults, but also just individuals to read through the sources along with my notes and really get a much deeper understanding of who this character is, as well as what I was thinking when I wrote the song. And because of that, as Larissa kind of mentioned, this is a sort of hybrid teacher training and just get to know Lilith. So there may be sources that I kind of skip over a bit to show the educators what's in the curriculum in case they want to use it. So you can just kind of ignore that if you're just here to find out about Lilith herself. And speaking of Lilith herself, she stands out from a lot of the other characters that I have written about. For one thing, she's apocryphal, which means that she does not actually appear in our Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. There is a little mention of something called a Lilith in the Book of Prophets, which may refer to legends about Lilith, which it may also be a kind of bird. No one quite knows. So she's really a legend that sort of got grafted onto Judaism. And the legend is of a sort of storm demoness who flies around at night. Her original name was Lilitu. She was very present in the imaginations of the Sumerian culture that preceded the ancient Israelite culture that Judaism grew out of. So it's sort of a fascinating spiritual and historical hybrid. This character of Lilith, where she was kind of in the air in the culture, is not in the books, but then was so present in the imagination that she kind of found her way into the books, as you'll see, and got grafted on. And because of that, it's a little bit different from studying other kinds of texts and other kinds of stories. I was thinking this morning of a science analogy where, if studying Torah is often a little more like biology or chemistry, where you're learning the traditions and some of the rules and some of the ideas and principles and ethics and things like that. This is more like string theory and black holes. So this is mysticism. It's spooky and weird, and it doesn't necessarily make sense. And so if you're someone who's newer to Torah study and you like this, there's definitely more of this out there. If you're newer to Torah study and you find this like a little overwhelming and creepy, there's definitely a lot of, this is not the center of the way that people generally study Torah. But for that reason, I think it's even more fascinating because she has been this fringe character that has evoked a lot of poetic, mysterious interpretations over the centuries and millennia. And the last thing I'll say is that one really fascinating aspect that I concentrate on here is also how people have interpreted her character over time. So what does this mysterious, powerful woman mean? Is she a demoness, or is she perhaps a heroine? So that's something that we'll look at. And because of logistics of webinar stuff, if I were in a room with you, I would love to hear everyone's voices and go very deep with you. And what we're going to do logistically here is that Larissa is going to be reading out the chats as they come in so that I can hear what you're saying and respond to it, while also keeping my eye on the sources as we go through. So we'll start with the biblical text. So as you may or may not know, this is a kind of strange thing. There are two versions of creation in Genesis, two distinct versions, like as if God started over. There are many ways of looking at this, from a religious perspective, from more of like a scientific text study perspective of what may have happened historically. But we're not going to even think about why for the purposes of this. We're just going to look at them and look at the differences between these two versions of the creation of humans, because this is one place that Lilith gets grafted onto Torah. So I'll just read this. It's maybe a little familiar. And God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep on the earth." And God created humankind in God's image. In God's image, God created it. Male and female, God created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep on the earth." So I won't even read the rest, but you can notice in verse 27, that second line, it's pretty mysterious, and it seems to change throughout the verse. Like God created mankind or humankind in God's image. In God's image, God created him or it. And then it says male and female, God created them. So we'll just kind of mark that as a bit of a mysterious description, where it seems that there's a sort of single creation in God's image, and then there's this idea of male and female in the very next phrase. Already mysterious and fascinating. So here is the second version, which comes in the next chapter of Genesis. And again, this isn't continuing on, this is a starting over. Then God formed the man, which in Hebrew is Adam, from the dust of the earth, which is Adamah. God blew into the man's nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him." And God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and all the birds of the sky and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever he called each living creature, that would be its name. And the man gave names to all the cattle and to the birds of the sky and all the wild beasts. But for Adam, no fitting helper was found. So here we go with the woman. So God cast a deep sleep upon the man. And while he slept, God took one of his ribs. The word in Hebrew is sal, which is literally side, and closed up the flesh at that spot. And God fashioned the rib that God had taken from Adam into a woman, and God brought her to Adam. Then Adam said, "This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man she was taken." So for the teachers out there in the curriculum, what I have next is these questions for discussion. How are man and woman created in each of these stories? What's the same and between the two versions, and how do they differ? That's sort of the first, just understanding what's going on here question, which we'll talk about. And then how do you interpret the fact that there are two different versions of the creation of humankind? Does this mean something happened twice? Is it two different angles on the same event? What do you think? So let's just go back to number one, and I'll just open it up for a chat. Um, what do you think is happening here in terms of the way that God creates the man and the woman? How do you interpret this? There's no one right answer, but how do you interpret this mysterious verse 27? God created humankind in God's image, male and female, God created them. We just spent a few minutes kind of hearing a couple of responses to what that seems to mean to you on the most, basic level, or how you might interpret that.
Looks like we have a bunch of people typing. So Sandra says, I think the way it is written sends the message that both man and woman were created in God's image. One is not superior to the other. And then Tara said, I hear this, that there was a singular creation that inherently manifested male and female qualities.
It's like so deep already. That's great. And I'd love to hear, I can see Sarah's typing, so I'll read that and then we'll go look at the second creation version.
So Sarah said, if God created male and female slash them in his image, it also means that God doesn't necessarily possess or embody a male image.
Yeah. So there's a very, very strong sense of parity, parity, right? Of there being this balance between the male and the female, and the reflection of God's image somehow being in each of them, perhaps equally. And it's quite different from this second version, in which this is, probably well, this is, sort of the version that I was much more familiar with, just growing up, in terms of what the culture passes down, that, it was Adam's rib. It was really fascinating for me to find out, when I first began to study this years ago, that it was literally a side, not necessarily a rib, and just how that kind of changes it potentially a little bit. But that Adam has this sort of anesthesia experience, this deep sleep. And Eve is literally taken out of his side. So what do you take from that in terms of what we might learn from that about this creation story's implication for the creation of man and woman?
So Sandra just said, maybe the first version is paving the road for the second version, meaning God points out that both are created in his image, even if in the process of creation, from potential to real, there has to be an
Beautiful.
order. And we have some other people typing as well. So Tara said, on one hand, I hear there may have been resistance on Adam's part. Tara, that's a need for the deep sleep.
Interesting. So maybe it wasn't just anesthesia out of, compassion for the physical experience Adam's going through, but maybe Adam was fighting against this experience of having a helper torn out of his side.
And then Sandra said, if we look at how the other living things were created, vegetation and animals, there is a difference between the creation of the potential seed, for example, and the real
Beautiful.
plant.
Yeah, and I'm, going fairly quickly, and so I'm sort of skipping over some of the other aspects of creation, but you could certainly spend an hour just looking at these two stories in terms of humans, plants, animals, and the perspective on the different perspectives in the two stories on all of that.
And then we just have one more comment from Tara, who said, compassion from God to allow the opportunity for Adam to wake to the need for partnership.
That's beautiful.
And it looks like Lisa is typing as well.
Beautiful. And we sort of touched on both of these, what each version might literally mean, how they might be related to each other, and then what it might mean that there are two different versions. I'm interested to see what Lisa is going to say, and then I'll move on to the next level of interpretation here.
So Lisa said the gap between the two does seem to imply a gap where there were two. Then Adam is alone, which is
right.
A problem.
So I think I'm understanding you, Lisa, that the gap between the two stories is, if you read them sequentially, is problematic from a logical perspective, where there seem to be male and female, and then the next chapter, here we are with just Adam alone. And yes, this is absolutely a problem, and that is precisely where Lilith comes in as one solution for that textual problem. So I couldn't have asked for a better transition. So here is a midrash proposing an answer to why there are these two stories and what they have to do with each other. So from Leviticus Rabbah, Rabbi Samuel Bar Nachman said, when God created the first man, God created him as an androgynous. Reish Lakish said that at the time Adam was created, Reish Lakish is another rabbi, that at the time Adam was created, he was made with two faces, and God sliced him and gave him two backs, a female one and a male one. So that's one opinion. The rabbis challenged him with a conflicting verse from Torah, which is, and God took one of Adam's ribs or sides. He answered them, do not translate the word sal as rib, rather as side, since later in the Torah, the same word is used to mean the wall of the tabernacle. And in case you're not familiar with the tabernacle, it was sort of a traveling temple that the Israelites used during their 40 years in the desert. So it was like a beautiful giant tent that they would worship in at each place and then pack up, move on, and then set it up again. So the walls were referred to each wall was referred to as a sal. And so he's making this linguistic connection. So basically, Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman is saying there was a first man that was actually, in that first story, it was actually a female and male, and God split that being into two. And that's why it says in 27, in God's image, God created it. That's the androgynous being. And then next beat, male and female, God created them. So that's the splitting. It's a pretty fascinating idea. And he is citing this other rabbi, Reish Lakish. Okay, so the rabbis actually are debating him, and they take the verse from our second story and says, yeah, but it says that the woman was created out of Adam's rib. And what he's doing here is actually answering by saying it's not a contradiction because it's not rib, it's side. So this is the same description, right? He's saying these are actually talking about the same story, that if you split the two sides of this original androgynous being, then you have male and female. So it's two lenses on the same story. Should we pause for a moment for comments and we'll go into the next midrash?
We do have a couple of comments. So Tara just said, and that was the format for the character on Cheers, the outspoken, strong Jewish female
Oh
Lilith
yeah, and she
married
said
to
above, oh yes, I
Frasier.
remember studying that Lilith was the problematic first woman. Exactly, exactly.
Oh,
Yes.
oh yeah.
And we'll get to her in a moment. So first we're opening up this space um of we're just kind of still looking at how to deal with these two creation stories together. And the word androgynos that he uses, I just wanted to kind of note because I think it's fascinating that the definition is a person who has both male and female sexual characteristics. And there are 149 references to androgynos in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And there's 350 references in classical midrash and Jewish law codes. That's from transtorah.org, which is a really fascinating website. So this is kind of an unusual area of inquiry in some ways, but it's also certainly not the only time that this concept is discussed by the rabbis, just to put it in perspective. Okay, so here's the great commentator Rashi, who has an explanation here. And Rashi often quotes other previous rabbis. He's a little later. He lived in 1040 to 1105. So he's often quoting previous rabbinic interpretations. So he says, male and female, God created them. Later, the Torah says, and God took one of his ribs. There is a midrash that in the first creation story, God created Adam with two faces and then divided them. So we just read that midrash that he's referring to. But the pshat, the simple literal meaning, is as follows. The first story teaches that they were both created on the sixth day, and the details of their creation come in the second story. So this is a lot like what Sandra was saying, that there is sort of an intro, big picture, here's how human creation fits into creation. And then in chapter 2, we get some specific details. And yeah.
So sorry, we just have a comment that's come in. So Cindy said, it's interesting that, quote, God gave him two backs, end quote, from the back. How does one see characteristics? Or from the back, how does one see characteristics?
Interesting. Yeah, I gave him two backs. So there's I think the image is that there's a face looking outward that's male and a face looking outward the other direction that's female, and then God splits down the middle, and so all of a sudden you have these two backs of two separate people. But I'm not sure if it's an interesting poetic comment as well, focusing on the back. I mean, I like that attention to that language there. So if there's any, I mean, I'd love to hear if there's any initial responses to these, and I might also just continue while you're typing. We can kind of gather them as we go, and we're going to look at one more level of text, which is mystical texts, and this is truly where things get very string theory, black hole, quantum physics, like a little mind-blowing. So this is, the mysticism is the branch of Judaism that deals with the unseen, with angels and demons and mysterious forces. And the Zohar is the quintessential book of Jewish mysticism. And so here is a mention of Lilith, that finally, for the first time. The male and the female were found together, and the female was attached to his side until God cast a deep slumber upon him and he fell asleep. And the Holy One, blessed be he, sawed her off him and adorned her as they adorn a bride and brought her to him. In an ancient book, I found that this refers to the primeval Lilith, who was with him and conceived from him, but was not a helpmeet for him. So I've spent a lot of time trying to parse how this relates to the first and the second, and it's not a one-to-one. We couldn't kind of analyze and say, okay, he's talking about, this is how he specifically fits them together, because it's not a one-to-one relationship. But what happens here is that the author of the Zohar is proposing that there is actually a first woman before Eve, and that these stories are two separate stories. So the first story, this Midrashic interpretation of the first story of the splitting male and female, creates not our friend Eve, but this proto-Eve whose name is Lilith, the primeval Lilith. But she was not a helpmate for him, right? So then there's a second creation process where Eve happens. So this is really an interpretation of primarily that first story. Although again, if you read closely, you notice there's the slumber from the second story. It's a little, it doesn't really parse out 100%. But this is where we get that idea that Tara was mentioning earlier, that they're actually two separate creation stories. And the first one is the creation of Adam and Lilith. And then Lilith goes away, and the second creation story is Eve getting taken out of Adam. Here's another section from the Zohar. Come and see, there is a female, a spirit of all spirits, and her name is Lilith, and she was at first with Adam. And in the hour when Adam was created and his body became completed, 1,000 spirits from the left, which is seen as the evil side, clung to that body until the Holy One, blessed be He, shouted at them and drove them away. And Adam was lying, a body without a spirit, and his appearance was green, and all those spirits surrounded him. In that hour, a cloud descended and pushed away all those spirits. And when Adam stood up, his female was attached to his side. And that Holy Spirit, which was in him, spread out to this side and that side, and grew here and there, and thus became complete. Thereafter, the Holy One, blessed be He, sawed Adam into two and made the female. And he brought her to Adam in her perfection, like a bride to the canopy. When Lilith saw this, she fled. And she is in the cities of the sea, and she is still trying to harm the sons of the world. So again, this is like a sort of different, weird, spooky version in which there's this original woman of Lilith who is, in this case, she actually flees because she's so sad because she sees Eve, who has been created as a more proper, wife for Adam. And Lilith is still out there and she's harmful. So this is another important point that happens. I see Sandra's comment, any comment in the Zohar on who the child from Lilith is. Do you see a child in this text? I think it's Lilith who was conceived from him. But let me know if I'm missing something. So one thing I find really interesting is, as some people mentioned, in that first story, it seems that there's this equality between the man and the woman. And we know, and in the second story, there's this sort of secondary nature to Eve, where she's taken out of a part of Adam's body. And it's interesting to see how when they sort of, this idea of Lilith gets connected with the first story, she gets cast as a dangerous being, which may be in part probably because of the history of the myth of Lilith and this kind of storm, like a demoness character. But it's really interesting that there seems to be this anxiety about the man and the woman being created both in the image of God. Seems to be a kind of 50-50 conversation between the two of them. That woman has to go, and there has to be this second creation starting over where Adam is the one in control, and Eve is made out of a part of him.
So we do have sort of similar to Sandra, Tara saying that she can read that Lilith was conceived from him, or that Lilith conceived a child by him. Maybe this piece of in the text and conceived from him maybe is a little.
It could be either way, yeah. And so one of and we're sort of, there's another text in the curriculum that is pretty long and intense, so I'm not including it here. But that goes into greater detail about Lilith sort of seducing human men every night and appearing in their beds, and then birthing these demon babies every single night that die before the morning. So she's this kind of powerful, dangerous, also constantly grieving, exiled creature, which again to me is an interesting way of dealing with the anxiety potentially of this creation story in which the man and the woman seem to be quite even. There's actually another midrash in which Lilith essentially asserts to Adam that she is equal to him. And in one version, it's that she actually wants some sexual dominance over him. And Adam goes and complains to God, and that's another reason that's given for her banishment. So dangerous, dangerous Lilith.
So we just had a map.
Yeah, no, the longer text is from the alphabet of Ben Sira, which I'm pretty sure is 9th century. And that's actually, it's on 8th century. And it's actually on the Jewish Women's Archive, that excerpt. And I quoted the Jewish Women's Archive in the curriculum. They describe it, I thought really well, interestingly, as a provocative and often misogynist satirical Hebrew work of the 8th century CE. And that's where she's first imagined as a first Eve. Okay, so I am going to play my song now about Lilith, and you can read along with the lyrics as you go. You can consider the questions or not. I'm going to get up and set up for just a moment. This song, I play violin through a looping pedal, which if you've never seen what that is, it's just a little electronic box on the floor that my violin's plugged into that I can step on and record what I'm playing over and over. So you'll notice I sort of build a bit of a one-woman orchestra by recording what I'm playing over and over. And if you want to see me playing it with a full band, there's on Vimeo, you can find it. And it's also on the Girls in Trouble website. There's live footage of a concert with me playing it with everyone in Girls in Trouble, which is sometimes a solo project, sometimes can be a full band. So I'm gonna set up and play that for you. And I won't be able to hear you because I'm going to leave this plugged in so it doesn't, I'm going to mute myself. So
Alicia, I don't know if you can hear me, but I don't know if we're going to be able to hear you if you mute yourself.
You're right, I can't mute. Okay. Sorry about that. Does this sound okay? Okay. What I did was I left my headphones plugged in, so I won't be able to hear you, but I can see you. So wave if something crazy happens. We are androgynous, double-faced beings, one looking forward and one looking back, formed in the light of the throne in the sky. We are never alone, and we never die. Two forms of dust, of the one and the many, a vapor to moisten and both to play. Two hands to form us, to guide us and shape us until we are ready to walk away. We are, 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 we are. Androgynous, double-faced beings, torn from each other and rendered into two flaming swords guard the garden of Eden. But I won't go back there without you. Okay. Could you hear that? Did that work? Okay. Can you say something? Okay. Wait. Okay, great. Perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure. Um, okay. So, I mean, I'd love to
Yeah, can you
hear
hear me?
responses and answers to these questions up here. And I'd also, since I happen to, this is sort of intended for when I'm not necessarily in the room, but since I am here, I'll say that my interpretation is part of sort of the more modern way of looking at Lilith, which is which is where the heroine part comes in, right? Sort of reclaiming Lilith, which began with the feminists in the 70s, and starting to say, well, maybe this kind of powerful, independent woman is not this dangerous, awful being, but maybe she's actually kind of a proto Wonder Woman type, and giving her some sort of respect and love. So my personal take on it when I sat down to write this song, all the Girls in Trouble songs are written in the voices of the characters. So writing this as Lilith, I thought about how that idea of an even equal partnership is quite similar to how many of us think of an ideal partnership today. But maybe 3,000 years ago, they weren't quite ready for that. And so I imagine her sort of saying, I'll come back to you when you're ready for me. But it is essentially a love song thing. There was a love there, but it was a little bit star-crossed by being a few millennia too early. So I'd love to hear some of these responses, and then we'll look at some visual art to end up.
Yeah, so we have a few things. So first, Tara said, first, beautiful, in all caps. Thank you. She said, it's so sad. She sees him as her partner. Herself, she must be lost and alone without him, blinded in a way, only able to see one perspective without him and aware that is unwhole. And then Lisa said, I see it as joyful, especially in contrast with the sources. They're part of each other. Neither of them is evil or bad, and they remain connected even when they're
Beautiful.
apart,
Yeah.
at least in her mind.
Yeah.
And then
Beautiful.
Adele
Thank you
said,
for those
Lilith's power
comments.
is in the image of God.
And one thing about sharing these songs with students, or just kind of even thinking about them individually, is I hope that I see them as being in the tradition of Midrash, which is the Jewish kind of indigenous Jewish creative tradition of commenting on texts by inserting new interpretations and new lenses onto them that connect this ancient text of the Torah to the contemporary world that we live in. And that's how one of the ways that I see what the rabbis have been doing for all these years, that they've been creating Midrash. So whether it's 11th century France or 9th century Egypt, they're finding a way to read their own reality into these stories, and make them relevant and make them meaningful. And I really love the idea that these stories are alive and that we are empowered to interpret them in the ways that make sense to us. And so I'm going to go through some visual interpretations, and we're going to rewind a little to the scary Lilith, 5th to 7th century, so really a long time ago. So there's these artifacts, these incredible artifacts, incantation bowls or magical bowls, also called demon traps. And you can see there's an illustration of Lilith at the center of it. And then, as it says on the very last line here, that it's the writing on this bowl quotes Exodus Isaiah and a different part of Isaiah, followed by some essentially spells, Judeo-Aramaic incantations. So this is trying to keep Lilith out of the house. It'd be buried upside down under the floor or at the threshold to keep Lilith away. So this is back, going back to this terrifying Lilith. Here's just another bowl. Here it is, a little bit larger. Many of these that have been found in the Near East. Another way that people would keep Lilith away was by these incredible amulets. Um, and there she is at the center, and she's bound. You can see there's like kind of symbolic chains around her. And again, there's these incantations all around. Um, she was considered to be very dangerous to pregnant women and birthing women and newborn babies. Um, she was seen to be like a reason for mothers dying in childbirth and babies dying early in their lives. So I think in some ways, these amulets were a way of giving people a sense of power over these things that they had so little control over. Here's an illustration much later from 1700s. And it's basically a how to make an amulet to keep Lilith away. And it's got the names of these angels who are actually referred to in that longer mystical text that we didn't look at today. So you can see the continuity over the centuries. This amulet, you can see it's kind of parchment, and it was found in India. They're not sure, if it traveled with Jews who were expelled from somewhere else, but it's pretty fascinating. Okay, and then finally the visual art. And here's another way of sort of tracing Lilith. So if we had, we just looked at some examples of these amulets to keep her away, where they have these kind of terrifying depictions of her. And then now we'll look at, you can really kind of consider, how is she being portrayed by this artist, for example, John Collier. So, there's the kind of like very sensual temptress, demoness temptress. She's often associated with the snake in Eden. So that's one version of Lilith. This is kind of similar, a little more dreamy and gauzy. And we won't read this sonnet right now, but you'll have access to this afterwards, and you can freeze the screen and read it. But it's this incredible sonnet about her strangling people with a single thread of her beautiful hair. So again, he's sort of reading the norms of his day into the Lilith myth. Here we get to the feminist reclaiming of Lilith. So this is the very first magazine cover of Lilith magazine, feminist Jewish magazine. Nothing like it had existed before. And you can see she's got her like kind of, she's got a talit, she's got a can of soup, she's got a long skirt with a high slit up it and a, kind of suffragette hat, and Hebrew and English on the block. So she's this American Jewish feminist woman. I'm looking at Sandra's comment that the amulets from the 5th, 7th century seem to indicate that before the Zohar there were texts portraying Lilith as being dangerous. So yes, we don't have any texts, but except for there is that 8th century text that I mentioned. So that's the very first one. But yes, there was a strong tradition that she was dangerous. We just don't have text except for that one 8th century text before the Zohar. And I'm just looking at these. Yeah. Yes, from this in 1976 to female Orthodox rabbis in 2016, we've come a long way. And Lisa said, interesting to tie together the imagery of feminism, sexuality, and traditional Jewish mother in Lilith magazine. Absolutely. Absolutely. Kiki Smith, I believe she's born in East Germany, but she's American. And she has this, some of you may be familiar with this incredible sculpture of Lilith. And I don't know if you can tell, but on the left, Lilith is actually crouching upside down on the wall of the museum. So she's kind of defying gravity, and she is kind of beautiful and terrible. And you have this sense of danger that it's this kind of heavy object that feels like it could fall. And then on the right is a close up of her face, and you can again get that sense there. I love how she combines kind of, there's this possibly demonic kind of feral aspect, but there's also this really personal feeling you get from the eyes of somebody in there having this experience experience. Yeah, if it's okay, maybe is it okay to keep going through the visual art and we'll read them as they come in?
We do have we seem to have a couple people.
So this is a female Dutch sculptor, Toni van der Vorst. And she wrote a little bit about this, that she was interested. This is part of a series about women kind of claiming their sensuality. I really love how it's, it's very sensual, but it's also very kind of calm. And, it's quite different from, if you look at Kiki Smith, it's like upside down and perched and kind of crouched. And this is, there's something very peaceful. Also interesting that she doesn't really seem to have a face. I see Tara's comment about, oh yeah, you want to read that, Larissa?
So we have Sure, yeah, so this refers to the sculpture Absolutely. Before, I think, but she said, I love this sculpture and the aspect of defying
this is
norms,
really
gravity, danger, beauty.
So here's Zoftig Lilith sitting on a branch in high heels and a polka dot bikini, casting these, her kind of fake scary lightning down at little Adam with his fake leaf there. More humorous interpretation. It seems to be almost mocking the fear of Lilith itself, which I really appreciate in this one. This is an artist who's also a Jungian psychoanalyst, so a lot of her art deals with these kind of deep themes of fire and water and dark and light. So here is Lilith riding off across the Red Sea, which happens in that book of Ben Sira text. And this is a contemporary woman painter, Eden Morris, who lives in New York, and she's got Lilith kind of stumbling out of the garden. So this seems to be the moment of expulsion, which is really interesting because we think a lot about the expulsion of Adam and Eve. But if we take this interpretation of Lilith, I love that Eden focus on the expulsion of Lilith and the trees, which are such an Eden, such an important thing in Eden, but they're sideways, which reminds me a little bit of the Kiki Smith, and the leaves on the trees look a little bit like Hebrew letters, like maybe yuds or shins, and you can see that she has the snake inside her. So she's also referring to that trope of Lilith being connected to the snake, and her eye is the snake's eye. I'll go back to, do you want to read Tara's comment? I'll go back to Tony's sculpture for a moment.
Yeah, so Tara just typed a couple of things. So she said Tony's sculptures, this one feels Buddhist, female Buddha, emphasis on femininity. And then she also said she becomes alive outside the garden.
Yeah, I actually had not totally noticed that, but her foot that's still in the garden is white, kind of unfilled in, unpainted, and then her skin color comes in when she's leaving. That's a great observation. This is a wonderful painter named Siona Benjamin. She's from Indian Jewish heritage. She was born in India, lives in New Jersey, and she often combines visual traditions of Indian painting with Jewish texts, and especially about women. So here we have kind of this comic book element, and then this fierce, brave Lilith, but with tears going down her face, and with a tallit and wings, and pierced with this bullet at her solar plexus, and she's saying, 1,000 years have I waited, keeping the embers of revenge glowing in my heart. So fierce, beautiful, angry Lilith. This is something that if you want to look it up, you can follow this link when you're, if you go back and watch this presentation again. It's a 2-minute clip from this whole dance performance that this artist created about Lilith, and you can see on the right that she's referring to that Kiki Smith sculpture. It's kind of amazing because she does with her body what the Kiki Smith sculpture did in metal as a way of exploring. And I love that as well, that the rabbis are referring to each other's commentary, and the feminist artists are referring to each other's commentary in a similar way. So finally, this is just a glimpse. This is obviously just a bit of if you do want to go deeper, either for yourself or in teaching. Each of the units contains my writing sort of in detail about the song, explaining the musical midrash with some footnotes, and then it also contains a page of ideas to jumpstart your or your students' own creative interpretation. So they're essentially creative prompts. And one of the things that I really hope to do with this project is also to empower everyone, no matter how much text background or art background or anything people have, to join this amazing tradition of Midrash. And like when you feel that little energy that's like, oh, I hate that interpretation, I think it was this way, that is the seed of Midrash. And so to think about just writing it down or sketching it or writing an argument against another one, it's really that is joining the tradition of commentary that keeps our text alive, and also it feeds the text by having this personal engagement with it, and it just adds to this conversation that's happening over the centuries. And I think it can also be a profoundly personally powerful practice to look at where we intersect with these texts and what do we think about them, what do we believe, what do we think is right, and how does it relate to politics going on or personal things going on. It can be a really, really wonderful source of kind of pleasure and thought in our lives. So I will leave you with that. And the last thing that I'll say is that these links, if you go to girlsintroublemusic.com, you can stream all the songs for free and they have lyrics on the page of each song. So that's, if you're interested in getting more of like an overview of a lot of different characters, please feel free to do that.
It looks like we have one more question, one more comment. It's okay if I read those out loud. So Cindy said, may I suggest Howard Schwartz's Tree of Souls? He has compiled a lot of lore about Lilith as Demoness. Do you suggest teaching only the modern
I don't know that book, so thank you, and I will
giving this
definitely look into
background?
that. And what my hope is that if someone is in a teaching context or even self-study, is that you will take it and run with it in the direction that feels most powerful. I think sometimes giving participants a grounding in where it did come out of basically helps them understand more what it means to have a feminist interpretation of it. But I really think that it's up to you.
And then Sandra just said, I have taught Alicia's Girls in Trouble curriculum for different kinds of groups and will be happy to talk to anyone who is interested in
Sandra
how to
is
make it work with
master
smaller large
educator.
groups. The
She's
results
based in
are
Florida,
amazing.
and this is an incredible offer because she's a that's amazing. Wow, thank you.
She also just provided us with her email address. So thank you so much, Sandra. And I hope people who are interested will definitely be in touch. Okay, so I guess I'm just going to quickly wrap things up. First, I just want to, Alicia, thank you so much for being with us today and deepening our knowledge of Lilith. And it's always just also such a joy to get to hear and see you perform. So thank you so much. So I just have a couple of announcements as I switch screens real quick. So we do have another online learning program coming up. I wanted to encourage everyone to save the date for Wednesday, June 21st at noon, 12 p.m. Eastern time. And it's based on one of JWA's new story collecting projects called the Story Aperture Project, where we're trying to collect stories of ordinary, extraordinary Jewish women from all over the country and maybe even all over the world. And the way that we're doing that is by training individuals to go out and collect these stories from the influential Jewish women in their own lives. So if you're interested in taking part in this project, I hope you'll join us on Wednesday, June 21st, where we will be training people to conduct oral history interviews so that you can participate. So there'll be more information available shortly as well as registration, but for now, please just save the date. The other thing is that at JWA, we always ask for our participants' feedback, and we really value your feedback. We use it to improve upon